more.
President Trump also announced a new trade deal with the UK. All that Britain demands in return is that we keep.
Colin Jost, the long-serving co-anchor of Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, has built a career on delivering sharp, often brutally honest political and pop culture commentary with a deadpan expression that belies the bite of his words. This past weekend, he turned that signature wit toward a figure who perpetually dominates the tabloid sphere, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. In a segment that quickly ricocheted across social media, Jost didn't just tease Meghan Markle, he offered a masterclass in satirical demolition, encapsulating the absurdity and exhaustion of the never-ending royal media saga. The setup was classic Weekend Update. Jost, adjusting his tie with an air of faux seriousness, launched into a seemingly straightforward news item. In other news, he began, the pause perfectly timed. Meghan Markle has announced the launch of her new lifestyle brand, American Riviera Orchard, which, for those of you keeping score at home, is approximately her 14th new career since moving to Montecito. The audience's laughter began to build, sensing the impending barrage. Jost, ever the stoic professor of sarcasm, continued without cracking a smile. That's right, she's now a princess, a duchess, an author, a podcaster, a philanthropist, a feminist icon, a victim of the press, and now a artisanal jam mogul. It's like if Macbeth was a character on The Real Housewives. Jost then expertly pivoted to the core of the joke, the glaring contradiction that the public often perceives in the Duke and Duchess's actions. The brand is reportedly all about the refinement of everyday life, which is a fascinating pivot from her recent interviews where she detailed the crippling isolation of being trapped in a 22-room mansion with no one to talk to but her husband and their team of staff. The line landed with a punch, highlighting the often overlooked privilege that frames their narrative of hardship. So now, for just $98, you can buy the jam that tastes like the freedom she found after escaping the oppressive monarchy by monetizing her royal title to sell preserves. It's a bold strategy. The Queen is probably looking down or up, depending on your perspective, and saying, we used to just colonize countries for their resources. This is much more efficient. The brilliance of Jost's attack lay not in mere mockery, but in its precision. He targeted the specific, almost comical branding language that has surrounded the couple's commercial ventures. The first product is strawberry jam, he noted, holding up a mock jar. The label says crafted with resilience, which is a fancy way of saying we stirred it very hard while thinking about Piers Morgan. He didn't stop there, connecting the new venture to the couple's ongoing battles with the media. Meghan says the name American Riviera Orchard is inspired by the scenic beauty of Santa Barbara. Critics are calling it a desperate attempt to trademark a vibe that already exists and is just called California. She's also sent out 50 jars to influential friends, which is either a lovely gift or a not-so-subtle threat to those who might consider criticizing her next podcast series. What made the segment so effective was its encapsulation of the public's growing fatigue. Jost spoke for many who find the Sussexes' journey from royal refugees to ultra-high net worth complainers increasingly paradoxical. It's just interesting to see someone who speaks so much about privacy launch a very public business that requires constant media attention, he mused, articulating the central critique that has dogged them since their Oprah interview. It's like someone quitting a stressful job at a billion-dollar corporation to find themselves, and then immediately starting a new business that requires them to constantly talk about their old job at the billion-dollar corporation. Jost even managed to rope in Prince Harry, as any complete takedown must. Harry, for his part, is reportedly thrilled. He's been put in charge of testing the jam on his various injuries from playing polo and invading Afghanistan. He says it has just the right amount of tang, which is also what he called Meghan in his memoir. By the end of the 2-minute segment, Jost had successfully held a mirror up to the entire Sussex industry, the lucrative, self-perpetuating cycle of revelation, victimhood, and commercialization. He didn't need to scream or trade in baseless conspiracy theories. His weapons were logic, observation, and impeccably crafted jokes that exposed the inherent silliness of the situation. The reaction was predictably polarized, which is perhaps the ultimate sign of a successful joke in 2024. Sussex supporters decried it as a mean-spirited amplification of misogynistic and racist trolls. Their critics cheered it as a long-overdue comedic reckoning, but beyond the partisan fray, the segment served a broader purpose. It cut through the carefully managed narrative and PR speak with the universal solvent of humor. Colin Jost from his NBC bully pulpit didn't just tell jokes about Meghan Markle. He performed a public autopsy on the modern fame machine itself, revealing the intricate mechanics of a brand built on royalty, rupture, and now, remarkably, raspberry jam, and he did it all without ever raising his voice.
Built electric cars, he's going to Mars. Why is he even involving himself with Twitter? It would be like if the Prince of England gave it all up just to marry an actor from Suits.
There is a particular brand of comedic alchemy that Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update has perfected over decades. The ability to transform current events into cultural verdicts, to wield laughter not just as entertainment, but as social commentary. Few segments have executed this with more devastating precision than Colin Jost's recent takedown of Meghan Markle, a monologue that transcended punchlines to become a full-fledged cultural moment. With the relaxed demeanor of a man discussing the weather and the sharpness of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, Jost didn't just roast the Duchess of Sussex, he deconstructed her entire public persona, holding it up to the light and revealing the cracks in the carefully crafted facade. The audience's reaction, a mix of roaring laughter, shocked gasps, and applause, signaled more than amusement. It was the sound of a public finally being given permission to voice its collective skepticism through the medium of comedy. Jost opened with the kind of faux solemnity that makes the subsequent blows land harder. In news that has absolutely stunned the dozens of people who are still paying attention to this saga, he began, a smirk playing on his lips. Meghan Markle has apparently discovered a new human emotion, the desire to not be filmed while simultaneously signing a multi-million-dollar deal to be filmed. The joke was a perfect distillation of the central contradiction that has plagued the Sussexes since their departure from royal life, the simultaneous pursuit of privacy and publicity. Jost, like a skilled mechanic, proceeded to take apart the entire engine of their brand, piece by comedic piece. He targeted their commercial ventures, particularly their short-lived Spotify deal, with brutal efficiency. Their podcast was canceled for lacking productivity, he noted, his delivery deadpan, which is corporate speak for, we gave you $20 million and all we got was 12 episodes about how hard it is to be you. For that kind of money, I'll tell you how hard it is to be me. I have to do this every week. The laughter was explosive because the truth was undeniable. The gap between their astronomical compensation and their tangible output had become a subject of public fascination and ridicule. But Jost saved his most lethal ammunition for his critique of Meghan's perceived sense of victimhood. He zeroed in on her recent public appearances and statements, which often frame her as a woman besieged by forces beyond her control. She's like a billionaire who keeps applying for food stamps, he quipped. The paperwork is never quite right, but the audacity is always perfect. This line cut to the core of the public's growing fatigue with the Sussex narrative. In a time of genuine global struggle, Jost argued, the complaints of a woman living in a California palace ring increasingly hollow. He contrasted her situation with that of working people, suggesting that her struggles were a luxury item most could not afford. Most people have real problems, he said. Meghan has narrative problems. The distinction was brutal and effective, reframing her not as a sympathetic figure, but as an out-of-touch fabulist. The masterstroke of the segment, however, was Jost's decision to frame the entire monologue not as an attack, but as an intervention. I'm not saying this to be mean, he claimed with impeccable timing. I'm saying this because I care. Someone needs to tell her. The Victim Act has an expiration date, and yours has a Best Buy stamp from about 3 press cycles ago. This posture of mock concern allowed him to deliver even more savage blows under the guise of helpful advice. He suggested with a straight face that her next business venture should be a line of products for the perpetually aggrieved, maybe a candle that smells like self-pity, a jam that tastes like missed opportunities. The audience was howling, but beneath the laughter was a sense of recognition. Jost was articulating what many had felt but lacked the platform to say, that the Sussex brand of grievance had become a tired product. The cultural impact of this segment cannot be overstated. By delivering this critique from the Weekend Update desk, a platform with a legacy of speaking truth to power, albeit through jokes, Jost legitimized a skepticism that had previously been dismissed as mere Meghan hating. He demonstrated that it is possible to critique the Duchess not for who she is, but for what she represents. A new archetype of modern celebrity where victimhood is leveraged for gain, where authenticity is a marketing strategy, and where the line between public service and personal branding has been erased. praised. For Meghan Markle, whose entire commercial value is tied to her likability and relatability, this kind of high-profile mainstream mockery is catastrophic. It doesn't just generate negative press, it fundamentally undermines the product she is selling. Colin Jost, with a few well-written jokes and a perfectly timed smirk, didn't just deliver a comedy routine. He performed a public service, using the power of laughter to hold a mirror up to one of the world's most famous women and allowing the world to see the reflection for what it truly is. A performance that has finally jumped the shark.
After that, going to Mars, why is he even involving himself with Twitter? It would be like if the Prince of England gave it all up just to marry an actor from Suits.
In the pantheon of Saturday Night Live's most brutally effective takedowns, a special tier is reserved for segments that transcend mere comedy and become genuine cultural events. Moments where a public figure's carefully constructed image is not just teased, but surgically dismantled on live television. Colin Jost's recent Weekend Update monologue targeting Meghan Markle firmly belongs in that hall of fame. With the poised delivery of a network news anchor and the lethal precision of a stand-up assassin, Jost did not merely tell jokes about the Duchess of Sussex. He launched a full-scale comedic invasion on the very foundation of her brand, culminating in a label that instantly ricocheted across the globe. Wannabe Diana. The phrase, delivered with Jost's signature deadpan smirk, was more than a punchline. It was a thesis statement for a growing public sentiment that Meghan Markle's narrative of victimhood and virtue is not an authentic evolution, but a calculated and ultimately failed attempt to inherit the mantle of the world's most beloved royal martyr. Jost opened the segment with an air of mock solemnity, setting the stage for what he framed as a tragicomic case of royal identity theft. In a shocking turn of events that has surprised absolutely no one with eyes, he began, a glint in his eye. Meghan Markle has once again found herself at the center of a media storm, this time for seemingly checks notes, trying to cosplay the ghost of Princess Diana. The audience, a mix of nervous gasps and explosive laughter, immediately understood the stakes. Jost was playing with cultural dynamite. Princess Diana's legacy is sacrosanct, a third rail of modern history that most public figures approach with reverence and caution. To accuse someone of attempting to appropriate that legacy is to level one of the most serious charges in the court of public opinion. Jost, however, did not present it as an accusation, but as an obvious, almost laughable conclusion. He methodically laid out his evidence, juxtaposing Meghan's recent public statements and curated photo ops, often featuring soft focus, introspective gazes, and vulnerable interviews about the perils of fame, with iconic, searing images of Diana's own struggles. It's the same playbook, Jost declared, but with one crucial difference. Diana was running from the cameras. Meghan is running toward them, but with a better publicist and a Netflix deal. The brilliance of Jost's attack was its multi-layered approach. First, he targeted their aesthetic mimicry, highlighting the alleged replication of Diana's visual language of solitude and resilience. Then, he went for the strategic jugular, contrasting their motives. Diana used her platform to bring attention to landmines and AIDS patients, he noted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Meghan uses her platform to bring attention to the difficulty of being Meghan. This was the core of his argument, that Meghan's exploitation of a victim narrative is not in service of a larger humanitarian cause, but in service of her own brand. He painted her not as an heir to Diana's compassion, but as a savvy, modern operator using the aesthetics of trauma to build a commercial empire. She's not following in Diana's footsteps, Jost quipped. She's just wearing a very expensive knockoff of her shoes. Furthermore, Jost expertly leveraged the medium's power to humiliate through juxtaposition. As he spoke, the screen behind him flashed between photos of Diana, alone on a bench in front of the Taj Mahal, a moment that became an enduring symbol of her isolation within the royal family, and paparazzi shots of Meghan and Harry on a similarly styled bench during a recent public appearance. The visual parallel was unmistakable and devastating. The message was clear. One was a moment of genuine captured emotion. The other, Jost implied, was a staged photo opportunity, a piece of performance art designed to evoke a specific and favorable comparison. It's not homage, Jost deadpanned. It's brand infringement. The fallout from the segment was instantaneous instantaneous and polarizing. Social media erupted into its predictable factions. Supporters of the Sussexes decried the bit as misogynistic and cruel, while critics celebrated it as long overdue truth-telling. But beyond the digital shouting match, Jost's monologue achieved something far more significant. It moved the criticism of Meghan Markle from the fringe realms of conservative media and YouTube commentators onto the main stage of liberal comedy. Saturday Night Live, a long-standing institution of the American cultural left, had effectively granted a mainstream permission slip to question the Duchess's authenticity in the harshest terms possible. By framing his critique within the context of Diana's legacy, Jost elevated the conversation from gossip to a cultural critique about the nature of public sympathy, the ethics of personal branding, and the lines between inspiration and imitation. In the end, Colin Jost's Wannabe Diana segment was more than just a comedy routine. It was a cultural verdict delivered from behind a news desk. It declared that the public's appetite for the Sussexes' victim narrative is waning, and that attempts to cloak commercial ambition in the sacred cloth of a princess's trauma will be met not with sympathy, but with satirical scorn. For Meghan Markle, a woman whose entire second act is predicated on controlling her story, the sound of America laughing along with Jost's brutal jokes isn't just a bad review, it's an existential threat to the foundation of her empire. Jost didn't just deliver a punchline, he may have finally punched a hole in the Sussex brand large enough for the whole world to see through it.
President Trump also announced a new trade deal with the UK. All that Britain demands in return is that we keep these two.
No! No! I refuse!
The moment Colin Jost locked eyes with the camera during his Weekend Update segment on Saturday Night Live, the atmosphere shifted palpably. This was not the usual lighthearted ribbing of a celebrity, it was something sharper, more consequential. With the delivery of a seasoned prosecutor who knows he has an airtight case, Jost didn't tell jokes about Meghan Markle. He issued a verdict. The laughter that followed each punchline was not merely amusement, it was the sound of collective validation, a widespread public acknowledgement that the Sussexes' carefully constructed narrative of virtuous rebellion had finally irreversibly curdled into a global punchline. This was not comedy for comedy's sake. It was a cultural reckoning, a public rebuke delivered from the most influential comedy stage in America, and it signaled the collapse of a brand built on the precarious foundation of perceived victimhood and performative authenticity. For years, criticism of Harry and Meghan had been largely confined to predictable corners: British tabloids, conservative media, and royal commentators. It was easily dismissed by their supporters as the bitter noise of an entrenched establishment or bigoted backlash. But Jost's monologue was a game changer. It represented the moment the critique went mainstream and, most importantly, respectable. Coming from Jost, a liberal, Ivy League-educated pillar of the East Coast media establishment, the takedown could not be dismissed as partisan or prejudiced. It was crafted with intellectual precision, each joke landing not as a cheap shot, but as an irrefutable point of logic. He targeted the central paradox of their existence: the multi-million-dollar deal struck in the name of privacy, the humanitarian advocacy that always seemed to circle back to their personal grievances, the relentless pursuit of public sympathy from the terrace of a Montecito palace. Jost held up these contradictions not with anger, but with the weary bemusement of a man stating the obvious. And in doing so, he gave silent millions permission to finally say, "I see it too." The specific genius of the attack lay in its framing. Jost presented his critique not as malice, but as a necessary intervention. He was the friend pulling someone aside to tell them they have spinach in their teeth, except the spinach was a crumbling public persona and the entire world was watching. "I'm not saying this to be mean," he claimed, a masterful setup that allowed him to be utterly devastating. "I'm saying this because I care. Someone needs to tell her the Victim Act has an expiration date." This posture transformed him from a bully into a truth teller, and his jokes into a public service announcement. He wasn't mocking her suffering, he was mocking the performance of it, the sheer scale of its monetization. When he suggested her next venture might be a candle that smells like self-pity, or a jam that tastes like missed opportunities, he was doing more than generating laughs. He was reducing her entire commercial empire to a parody of itself. The aftermath of this public rebuke is what truly reveals its power. A takedown on SNL doesn't just generate headlines, it seeps into the cultural groundwater. It becomes a shared reference point, a meme, a shorthand for a widely held sentiment. The Jost verdict effectively stripped the Sussex brand of its last shred of diplomatic immunity from satire. It proved that their story is no longer protected by its former status as a progressive cause. It is now fair fair game for comedy based on its own evident absurdities. For Meghan and Harry, whose influence is entirely dependent on their popularity and perceived likability, this is an existential threat. You cannot sell content, products, or a brand of compassionate leadership on a platform of global sympathy when that sympathy has been publicly and hilariously revoked by late-night television. The collapse Jost heralded is not of a family, but of a narrative, the story they have been telling the world of their escape, their persecution, their virtuous new path has been overwhelmed by a counter-narrative of hypocrisy and privilege. Colin Jost, with a writer's wit and a news anchor's delivery, didn't just point out the plot holes, he directed the audience to laugh at them. And in the court of public opinion, laughter is the most powerful gavel of all. It doesn't just dismiss a case, it annihilates it. The message from the SNL stage was indeed loud and clear. The rebellion is over, the performance has been reviewed, and the review is a riotous, devastating, and final pan. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please do not forget to leave your thought in the comments section. See you in our next video. Thanks for watching.